One of the surprising things that's happened for me at this last chapter in my career is that through a variety of events, partly related to this Foundation for Psychocultural Research and how it evolved, and then some opportunities that arose, I've re-engaged with some interest in neuroscience, which was there early on in my training as an undergraduate in psychology. I did research on physiological psychology. I did experiments, I'm almost ashamed to say, with mice and rats, implanting electrodes in their brains and measuring electrical activity and so on. So not something that I decided to do as a career, partly because I was terribly allergic and I would break out in hives every time I handled the rats, so that was a disincentive, but also because, yeah, it was a disturbing process, but I think one can be sufficiently fascinated with the brain or hope that one's going to learn something important that many people continue this work. Now, of course, we're in a different era where we have marvelous methods of brain imaging that are non-invasive and give us these incredible pictures of the brain and even of some of the activity in the brain in terms of changes in blood flow and electrical activity and so on. So what happened for me was that this program that I was involved with, this Foundation for Psychocultural Research, which was founded from the very beginning with the idea that it would build connections with neuroscience, partly because the anthropologist who created it and whose vision it reflects, Rob Lemelson, had done he works in Indonesia and Bali and Java, and part of his doctoral project was working with I think a WHO or other international project looking at Tourette's and OCD and its relationship to exposure to rheumatic fever and so on, kind of tracing that. So he was working on a neuropsychiatric topic at the same time as he was looking at things like Balinese, healing rituals and stigma and other kinds of more strictly social issues. And I think he developed a commitment to trying to bring ethnography and the tools of ethnography and the person-centered perspectives that come out of that into some kind of dialogue with psychiatry and with neuroscience. So I was partner to that, as I mentioned already. I was involved from the get-go in terms of the meeting he held to try to think about the directions for this foundation. I took part in many meetings. For a time, I was the external site reviewer of the program. I was at the conferences that they held. I edited the first book on trauma from that conference. There was a subsequent book edited by Carol Worthman, an anthropologist, biosocial anthropologist, on emotion. I then edited another book that came out of that program called Revisioning Psychiatry, which came originally out of a conference on culture and psychiatry, but there were not enough papers. People had not been committed to the papers beforehand, and so things dried up. I mean, these were conferences, I should say, that conference, one of the keynote speakers was Eric Kandel, who won the Nobel Prize for neurophysiology. So, these were people who had many commitments, and so they were wonderful to have there, but they were not necessarily able to engage in a sort of ongoing project in the way that we had imagined. So I ended up having a chance to do quite a bit of reconfiguring of that book, Revisioning Psychiatry. And so it came to represent my own interests and concerns as they overlapped with those that the Foundation for Psychocultural Research had developed. Specifically, one part of the book is about restoring phenomenology to psychiatry, with the idea that the deeper engagement with the quality and texture of experience in American psychiatry had been pushed aside by just sort of checklists of symptoms described in a very simplistic way, and so we lost all the dimensions of meaning and the variation in symptom experience and so on. So we were able to have some discussion of that, including I have a chapter of my own in that talks about empathy that began as a paper in the journal Ethos on the whole issue of empathy cross-culturally, issue that had been organized by Doug Holland and Jason True. And then a second part of the book that is really putting neuroscience together, but we frame it as cultural neuroscience because the argument is that the brain is the organ of culture. The kidney is the organ of clearing the bloodstream of substances and so on. The brain is there precisely to acquire culture. And we're born with an immature brain, and it grows and develops for 20, 30 years hugely. And what's going on during that time is we're learning language, we're learning how to navigate a social world, we're learning relationships with people, and that's what it's there for. And so things that go wrong with the brain reflect what it's meant to be used for and how it's being used or not being used. So that is a very different view of neuroscience than the idea that we'll just study the brain at a molecular level and know everything we need to know, because it says you can't know what the brain is really doing unless you understand the world that it's engaged with. So that points in a certain direction. And in particular, it points toward a whole body of work that's come to be called 4E cognitive science. And 4E cognitive science, which emerged out of work coming from a variety of thinkers, heavily influenced by the philosopher Merleau-Ponty, and also through through work by systems theory work by Umberto Maturana and others. Much of it at one stage filtered through the work of Francesco Varela, who was a neuroscientist from Chile who ended up in France doing really path-breaking work in neuroscience and in immunology, who was also a Buddhist practitioner, so who became very interested in Buddhist models of the self and the person and the ways in which the self might be an illusion that is created by ways we engage with the world and with ourselves. And he co-wrote a book with the philosopher Evan Thompson and the psychologist Eleanor Roche on the embodied mind. And this introduced a notion of embodiment that aligns with the way I was talking about the body when I was talking about metaphor, that argues that, and with Merleau-Ponty, that the body is intrinsic to human experience and phenomenology, that we can't think about cognition just as an abstract computation in the brain, like moving bits around in a computer program, that cognition is a process of acting in and through the body on the world, that it involves loops of sensation and action, and that's what thinking is. Thinking is a biological process of engaging with the world. And this work comes from Maturana and Varela, and then it gets elaborated in many different directions. In anthropology, it hooks up to some degree with the more purely phenomenological take on embodiment that's represented in the work of Tom Chardash and others. But it also connects with the kind of embodiment that I was talking about earlier from Nancy Krieger, that says embodiment is also how the world inscribes itself on the body in very physical and physiological ways. So ranging from the superficial level that we tattoo ourselves and adorn ourselves and now we carry something on our body, to the deeper level that we've had certain experiences and so our body reacts certain ways whether we want it to or not, and that's part of who we are. So that's embodiment means a lot of different things, but it makes the body a locus of experience and something we have to understand. And so there is all this research on embodiment. The 4E part begins with embodiment, but it goes on to talk about enactment. So enactment is this idea that what cognition is for, what thinking is for, what human experience and thought are for, is to act on the world so that we survive. The most basic thing is that we have to make sure we get enough food and we don't get too hot or too cold. So all human thought, all human action is oriented toward action ultimately. So that's the enactment part, and that means that we think through our bodies. We don't have to catch a baseball, we don't have to compute the trajectory. We line our eyes up with it and we run so that we keep a certain angle and we arrive at the right spot where we can catch the ball. So it turns out that is easier than doing the computation. What's the trajectory? Okay, now I know the coordinates, I'll run to those coordinates. We would never get there in time. So that's a model for how what an enactment is in terms of how we function. And then the other two E's are embedded. So we're always experiencing our body and our action in a particular place and time, and we are affected by that. I'm here in this chair talking to you. We're in the room together. we're talking to an imaginary audience. That's also part of the experience, and that's the context I'm embedded in that is influencing what I think of, what occurs to me next, what doesn't occur to me, how I phrase it, all of that. And finally, it's extended in the sense that I can look down at my notes to see what I need to know to remember next. I can search on my computer. I can read your face when you tell me, oh yeah, that sounds interesting. Okay, maybe I'll say a bit more about that. So my thinking is not only with my own actions, it's with you. It's with these resources that represent other people who've helped in the past or created certain things. So that's the extended part. So this 4E view leads to a very different picture of what human beings are doing that's very consistent with what anthropologists have been saying from the beginning. And we can find lots of precedent. In fact, if you trace the history of this, if you trace, well, where did Maturana come from? Well, Maturana was also part, he was doing biology. He was part of this network and the Macy conferences and so on in the 40s and 50s where Gregory Bateson participated. And Gregory Bateson had anticipated a lot of this stuff in his work in Naven when he talks about schismogenesis, and he's really trying to think about interactional processes and how they can go on their own. So he discovered in the 40s, as this new language was created by Norbert Wiener and so on, suddenly here's the language of cybernetics and systems theory that gives us a more formal way of talking about these processes that were exactly what social anthropologists were interested in. So we're at a moment in time now when this work has evolved. And when I read about it first, I was reading about it as an undergraduate and reading Gregory Bateson's book, Steps Toward an Ecology of Mind, which was very important to me, and reading Ludwig von Bertalanffy's book on systems theory and reading Norbert Wiener. All of this stuff was very interesting, but it was viewed somehow as pretty far from current social science or other things. We're now at a moment where it's not far at all, where actually it's very much taken on board by many people who are doing modeling, who are doing agent-based modeling, who are doing complexity theory and trying to develop actual models of interactive processes that go beyond individuals' computations. So what's happened for me is things have come full circle. The things that I read when I was in my late teens and I was all excited about, but that seemed a little bit, some of these things I came to by reading the Whole Earth Catalog and Coevolution Quarterly. They're like part of counterculture. Gregory Bateson was like an icon of the counterculture because he seemed to be saying these slightly gnomic, Zen-like things that were somehow also connected to this very abstract idea. Interestingly, one of the books at that time that was popular was a book by Spencer Brown called The Laws of Form, which was this very simple calculus. Francesco Varela, as a young man, wrote a long article in the Journal of General Systems Theory elaborating this theory of Spencer Brown's. So all these interesting confluences have come together at a moment where suddenly this 4E cognitive science is taken very seriously. It's almost become mainstream. There are very serious philosophers doing this. Mentioned Evan Thompson, Sean Gallagher, Alvin Noe, Daniel Hutto, all with their own versions, all with many debates and disagreements among them, but really a kind of major enterprise of elaborating this idea of cognition, and by cognition I mean really all human thought and experience, let's say, is embodied, is enacted in the world, is embedded in the world, and depends in an extended way on the world. And the final wrinkle on this then is this most recent thing. I had a postdoctoral fellow, a doctoral student actually, and then a postdoctoral fellow, Maxwell Ramstead, who's a philosopher trained in continental philosophy, who came to work with me and who developed an interest in the emerging work on predictive processing or active inference, or the Bayesian brain. And this is an approach to the brain that comes from a variety of work in artificial intelligence and computational neuroscience. The leading figure in this is Carl Friston in London, who is actually the most cited neuroscientist in the world. And who's developed this idea that what the brain is doing is predicting what's going to happen next. And when that prediction doesn't match, we get an error signal, and it gets kicked up to another level of processing. Okay, my expectation wasn't met, I better think harder. If it does match, we just go on. It's business as usual. It's automatic. That's what we need, because we don't want to have to think hard about everything. The consequence, though, is that what we're actually engaging with all the time is not simply the world that's out there, but our projection of the world that's out there. right? And that happens all the time. I'm sitting and looking at you. This is back to phenomenology. I'm sitting and looking at you. I can't really see all this stuff over here, but in my mind it's already filled in because there's a prediction of what that should be. And if you ask me later what's there, I'll tell you what's there because it's what should have been there. And if something small changes, I might not even notice it, right? We have this change blindness. There's these wonderful videos you can watch online where somebody changes their shirt multiple times while they're talking, and you don't even notice it because your attention is drawn to something else, and then they'll replay it and show you weren't even noticing it. These are all illustrations in a way of this very general principle. Anyway, what's happened is this very mathematical kind of approach to understanding the brain. We have now, with Maxwell and with Samuel Vessier, an anthropologist, and with Carl Friston, have tried to make an argument that we can think about the human brain as a cultural process that engages with other people. So we have a paper in the Behavioral and Brain Sciences, which is a leading journal for debates around cognitive science, called Thinking Through Other Minds, that basically says this is what human beings are doing, that we think we have our own cognition for sure, and we have our own representations, but a lot of what we do and a lot of what culture is we relying on other people, and we have a kind of call and response. We know how to work together to make things happen. And this is a way and this can be modeled, at least in a general abstract way, exactly the way that we would model the brain doing something, except now it's 2 brains, or 3 brains, or 100 brains, it depends. And now it's a history of different things. And so what's interesting for me about this is not that it's going to be very practical to do, that we're not going to go do elaborate models, but what it does conceptually and ontologically is it breaks down. I began by saying, I was trained in a very positivist tradition. It actually breaks down a barrier between the claims that we have a hermeneutic tradition that's interested in meaning and interpretation, and is totally separate from a positivist tradition that's just interested in mechanism. And we just can't put those together. This actually says, I think you can put those together. You just have to understand that meaning resides in relationships of a person to an environment, of people to each other. And if you take those into account, now you have a very different picture. And now things are going to happen that are not just about the mechanics of a single brain or a single circuit in the brain, but now are the mechanics of relationships, like Gregory Bateson described, and so on. So suddenly we're recuperating the social as being, conceptually at least, on the same universe of discourse as we might want to model the brain and so on. So this is a bit surprising for me that I find myself now, coming full circle, saying the original paper that I talked about, this juvenile paper that I wrote on this old Facet typewriter long before there were personal computers, on the psychobiocultural investigation of the human nervous system, I could say, well, that paper done with my colleagues and so on really speaks to that. So the final thing I'll say about this is, again, another thing happened in parallel. A few years ago, I was invited to join a proposal that was being developed in McGill for a huge neuroscience project called Healthy Brains for Healthy Lives. And this was to a fund in Canada that funds innovative work that will have an impact on Canadian society, bringing all the different research councils together, the Canada First Research Excellence Fund. And they had put in a version of this proposal that they were not successful with, but they were told you need to have some social science in this proposal. So I was invited to take part, and I contributed to it. And we got this grant. And it's an $85 million grant for big data neuroscience. So brain imaging and artificial intelligence and all this other stuff. And I'm supposed to help with the social science part of this. This started many years ago. We're far into this process. It's been a real challenge to get the social science taken seriously within this. I think there's really still a lack of comprehension. But I have now been sort of given some of the responsibility to develop one of the outputs of this, which is something that it was named in the grant. We'll see what it finally looks like. The Canadian Framework for Brain Health. And so the challenge that I'm facing is, I think we can say interesting things about the brain, just like what I just told you, but the lesson of it is that neuroscience cannot just be about the brain. That neuroscience has to be about people. It has to be about bodies, it has to be about social worlds, it has to be about relationships, it has to be about language, it has to be about the ways that we conceive ourselves. Because if I tell you, oh, this is a problem with your brain, you think about yourself differently and you act differently. And Fernando Vidal and Francisco Ortega have written about this, that we're living in the time of an embrained sense of self, and people think about themselves that way, and that has consequences, good and bad, like any other metaphor, like any other partial truth. It has consequences. So for me, the challenge in this right now, working in dialogue with neuroscientists, and I should say one of my postdocs earlier, a colleague now, Suparna Chowdhury, who's trained as a developmental neuroscientist, came to us to do a postdoc in cultural psychiatry and developed a field in a way, or a way of grouping together many pre-existing activities that she calls critical neuroscience, which is basically bringing philosophy and social science to bear on asking what's going on with neuroscience. What are people doing here? Why are they framing problems a certain way? What does it mean when we say, oh, psychiatric disorders are brain disorders? Which I think is a partial truth, which is not strictly true, but it has a lot of consequences, and that's how we're operating in psychiatry. So I find myself at a very interesting point right now of returning to some of my earliest interests with some challenge to present some ideas that might be useful in health policy, that might lead us not to adopting a reductionistic approach to the brain, might understand if we can understand the brain as the organ of culture. So it matters a lot. It's not just what food you feed the brain, but what ideas you feed the brain. That it's very important, and what kind of environment you're living in, what other people you're living with. That's going to determine what we might want to call brain health. I mean, to me, brain health is an odd locution anyway. It's just like saying heart health or, elbow health. I mean, health is supposed to be of people and of communities and some larger entity, not just of individual organs. So we already have a problem from the beginning to kind of begin to decenter a bit from that. But anyway, these are my current preoccupations, and it's interesting having talked about it today because it does involve a kind of coming full circle, maybe, to try to revisit things that interested me when I was very young. So.